Okay, this video is a quick summary and review of the basic principles from our Advanced Ethics module. I'm going to then move on to talking a little bit about the various ways that you can test to see whether something's an ethical violation and how you might go about acting if it was. And then at the very end of the video, for people who choose to watch all the way to that point, I'll go back and actually review some of the principles we talked about in the introductory ethics module, and you are not only welcome to, but are encouraged to refer to them when you're doing the exercises as well. So again, this does not replace you getting in contact with me if you have any further questions. If anything I say here is still not clear, then please let me know. Because when you're doing this assignment, it's very important that you speak in the language of these materials we're about to go through. You have to refer to these principles by their proper names so that I can tell that you know when something is actually occurring in practice. That's the whole idea behind this module, to be able to show how ethics are reflected in practice. So let's go through them. First principle is the principle of being client-centered, and this simply means that at the root of everything we do should be the client's needs, wants, preferences, and values. That we should not preach to people, prescribe to people, or give somebody else, say for example another professional or a family member, the first priority in terms of deciding what happens. The exception to this rule, of course, is that when we're dealing with somebody under 19, their parent is legally our client. But even then, we try to align client and family member. And the idea here is not to say that we cannot have an approach that suits the client and suits other people. Compromises can be achieved, but we would not, for example, forsake a client's priorities in the interest of, let's say, a staff person. An example of this is if a staff person said that they didn't want the current menu in the home because they didn't like the food that was there. But the clients do like the food. If they change that menu, they're behaving unethically. On the other hand, if the clients don't like the food and the staff do, it is still ethical to change that menu. In fact, it's the correct procedure. Hopefully that helps. Next one is this one: equity, fairness, and non-judgment. Here, the basic idea is to treat people as equals, to give everybody their fair share. Now, in some cases, people have to earn their fair share. So, for example, a person who works 3 hours would be fairly compensated more than somebody who works 2 hours at the same job. So that's not an example of somebody being inequitable. But an example that would be inequitable would be if a staff person burnt the food that they were cooking and then said, well, I'm not going to worry about serving this to the people in the home because they're too disabled to know the difference. That would be an example of somebody being inequitable. They wouldn't do that same thing for somebody who wasn't disabled. And another example of this would be giving something more to one client than to another client when there's no meritable reason for doing that. So basically, anytime you see people being treated as less than equal or without fairness, this principle is violated. The next is the principle of dignity, and dignity can be thought of as the well-being of a person on the emotional, spiritual, and social side. It's sort of like safety, but all the safety of our inner spirit. And you can tell when somebody has violated dignity when they've done something that a reasonable person would expect compromised our dignity, making us feeling embarrassed, humiliated, that sort of thing. Now, it's important to understand that people are allowed to do things that are wacky and crazy if it's their own choice. So, for example, if you came to school one day wearing Mickey Mouse ears and it was your own choice, that wouldn't be a violation of dignity. But if somebody made you wear them, it probably would be. One of the concepts here is the concept of dignity of risk, and it's important to remember that this concept means that there is dignity to be achieved by taking reasonable risks in our lives. For example, taking a test, entering a new relationship, or trying the diving from the top diving board are all examples of reasonable risks. So our job is to support people in trying those risks and to minimize any unnecessary damage or danger, but also to support people. And if they fail, to be there to help them through that failure. For example, if a person has a relationship that doesn't work out, we might provide emotional supports. If a person takes a test and fails the test, we might help them both emotionally and with academic skills. Another example of a dignity violation is anytime you see people impinging on others by punishing them or unnecessarily controlling them. And this also violates our principle of non-aversion, that's punishment, and our principle of least restriction, which we've talked about in the first module. And I'll go through that a little later on. But it's definitely a dignity issue if somebody is punishing somebody else. Number 4 is inclusion. And this principle is normally represented more by a standard that must be achieved rather than by doing something that's contrary to the principle. But this word, segregation, which is mostly behind us historically, is an example of a practice that is unethical. So if a person is knowingly separated from other people because they're different based on disability, then that would be an example of somebody being segregated. So the idea is that people should be able to integrate in meaningful relationships. This means being connected to family, friends, all the sorts of relationships that you might find enriching in your life, like coworkers, colleagues, even something like pets. If the only people in an individual's life are paid professionals, then the standard is not met in this particular example. Next is the concept of comprehensiveness, and this is sometimes called a holistic approach. And it simply means that we do not give people service one item at a time or in a piecemeal fashion. We should instead try to touch all of the possible bases to try and bring everything that we have to bear at once so that we are completely supporting that person. If, for example, we provided a person a meal as part of their residential services, but made them stay downstairs in a rec room all day long watching television and didn't provide them with any sort of psychosocial supports, then we would clearly be not meeting this standard. Just meeting a person's health needs is not enough. Advocacy. This means speaking up for the person when they cannot do so for themselves, or better yet, helping people to speak up for themselves. And it also includes a type of advocacy we call advocating for professionalism. Advocacy in general means that we would speak up when we saw that something was being done to harm another individual. We can advocate for a person in that case. Advocacy for professionalism is very close to this, but it refers to us advocating even when there's no obvious cost to a person. An example of advocating for professionalism might be if an individual was taking stationery supplies from the program and taking just a little bit of this and a little bit of that so that nobody ever noticed. Even though that wouldn't directly affect most clients, it is gradually eroding services. And so whenever you see these little examples of erosion, we, as the other professionals around that, are affected by this principle called advocating for professionalism. And what it says is, if we don't act on that, if we don't tell the person not to do that or report that, then we are ourselves participating in it and we're violating a principle. So if you're standing by and letting things happen that are unethical, then you're violating that principle. Honesty and integrity. I think most of you already understand this principle, but it basically means not to lie, steal, cheat, defraud, or an intentional violation of the rules or laws. So anytime, for example, a person knowingly violates the policy where they work, they are not following this principle. If you disagree with the policy where you work, then your choices are to either accept the policy and just do your job, and that's a good practice sometimes. You might disagree, but you might also say, it's not that big of a deal to me. And the other option is to advocate, is to go to somebody above you and actually advocate for a different approach. It's important to understand that just telling other people and gossiping is not the same as advocating. So honesty and integrity means not violating the rules where you work, not lying, stealing, cheating, any of that sort of thing. Commitment. This basically means that we have to go out and do our best. In the last module on ethics, we talked about effectiveness, and this is closely related to this. We must do the best we possibly can. We must use techniques that we genuinely believe are likely to work, and we should not use techniques that we know won't work. So, for example, if we are taught that giving a person a medicine an hour and a half late is not going to be safe, and we still do that just because we're watching a hockey game at work, chances are we're not being very committed. Another way of looking at this one is if you see concrete evidence that somebody is cutting corners or being lazy, you could describe them as not being committed. Next is competency and currency. So this refers to our skill level and to some extent our certification level. So sometimes people confuse this with the idea of safety, but we want to talk about how those things are somewhat separate. If I don't have a valid first aid certificate, for example, I have violated the principle of competency and currency. I shouldn't be at work without a valid first aid certificate. But it doesn't automatically mean that I forgot all of my first aid or that I did something unsafe. And the opposite is equally true. I could have my first aid certificate, but still not behave in a safe way. So while the two of them are intended to support each other, they're not the same thing. So this simply says that we must make sure we remain current in all of our training, that we actually have the skills we need before we take on a job, and that we should not take on work that we are not qualified to do. If we need other help, we should go and get it. There's a principle in the other module called consultation, and it also refers to this idea that if we're, for example, doing a program for a client, we need to make sure that we get insight from other professionals who know that client or their diagnosis well. For example, getting advice from a pharmacist when there's been a medication error would be a perfect example of how we exemplified this principle. Privacy and confidentiality will remind you there are three different ways privacy is demonstrated. The first is confidentiality, and this means that we have to protect the information of clients, the agency, and our coworkers. And it also includes their possessions. So for example, if I was to give a policy manual from one employer to another without getting permission, that would violate this principle. If I was to give any kind of information about a client that could be used to identify them, even if it wasn't their name, then I would violate this principle. And again, it could be written information, electronic information like emails, or verbal information. And just because a coworker shares information with you does not mean that they have given you authorization to share it with others. So unless there's an imminent concern that somebody is not safe to work with, then you should be keeping that information to yourself. The second type of privacy is this one here, which refers to possessions or ownership. So this refers to possessions such as a person's objects, but also their spaces. So for example, if I was to go into somebody's purse without permission, most people would feel that their privacy had been invaded. Or if I was to go into your bedroom without knocking and then waiting for an answer. Similarly, I'm not allowed as a staff person to use your personal belongings, or certainly not allowed to take them home and that sort of thing. And if there is a reason to use your personal belongings, I'm expected to demonstrate care. So for example, if I was helping a person into a van and then had to fold their wheelchair up and got frustrated and started kicking it, I would be violating this principle because that wheelchair is obviously an important possession for them, and damaging it or being careless with it would almost be being violent towards the individual. And finally, we want to talk about respect for people's body privacy. And this means that we do not allow any sort of intrusion into somebody's body privacy unless they have given permission. This can include touches like hugs, for example, or bathing or other hygiene, but it can also include medical procedures like, for example, dental work, massage therapy, or even giving a medicine to somebody. And it can also include things like standing too close to a person because you're invading their personal space, or ogling their body, any of these things. So it's important to understand that all of those are important. And closely connected to this is the idea of informed consent, which is identified in the first module. If a person is not given information before they're given a choice, and if they're not given the ability to make a choice about these types of procedures, we're violating informed consent, and we're violating body privacy when we go ahead and touch somebody or do something medical to them without their permission. Honor and accountability. So basically what this means is that I have to be open and accountable all the way through my work. If somebody has questions, I must answer them. If I do any type of work, I must keep a record of it. If I spend money or other resources, I must keep a record of it. So for example, if I was to go out grocery shopping and forget to get a receipt, one time would probably not be considered to be a lack of accountability. But if I consistently felt it wasn't important to demonstrate how I was spending the client's money, that would definitely violate. The concept of honor is closely related. I always say to people that we should act as though we're being scrutinized at all times, and this includes our work outside of the job. So for example, if you were to be convicted of child abuse outside of your job or drinking and driving, these can actually be seen as a violation of your principle, even if they happen in your personal time, because you are entrusted by the public to have honor and to be somebody they can feel comfortable leaving vulnerable people in the care of. And this is why we do criminal record searches, because it is expected that we would be honorable even outside of our workplace. So if, for example, a person robs a bank and they work as a CSW, they're violating this ethic. Avoidance of conflict of interest, and this one really tends to mess people up, but it's actually quite simple. First, we want to basically say that we all should be doing our job because our interest is aligned with that of our clients. In other words, we should get further ahead by helping other people in our care to get further ahead. So if you go to work and you work 12 hours really hard and you get paid overtime because you did that, then your interest is not in conflict, but is in alignment with your clients and your employer. But you should not gain in any way that might potentially be in conflict with your clients. And most of the time, we're talking about either financial gain or we're talking about a social gain, such as giving a family member or a spouse a job. And so whenever we hear about something called nepotism, which means hiring our family or friends, we know there's a conflict of interest that needs to be dealt with there. So in order for you to establish that there's a conflict of interest, you must always be able to point to the competing interest, the interest that might get in the way of how you're going to support that client. So for example, if I was to come in and try to sell a client vitamins, then I would be in conflict with the other principle I have, which is to maintain their physical safety, because even if I knew somebody was being sold a vitamin that wasn't particularly safe for them, I might be, my judgment might be mixed or altered because I stood to gain by being the person who profited from those vitamin sales. So what do I do if I have a potential conflict of interest? Well, there's two choices. Choice number one is to simply not do it, not sell the vitamins, for example, or to go and declare my potential conflict before it happens to somebody who is at arm's length and in authority. So if I go to my boss and I say, boss, I have these vitamins, it's exactly what you're looking for, and he or she checks it out and makes sure that it's safe, then they may declare that the conflict is okay. One of the most common things people do is think that theft is a conflict of interest, but it isn't. Theft is not a competing interest. There's nothing competing about it all. It's completely exploitative, and this is sometimes complicated. But if I'm trying to sell you my used car and you're a client, then my hope is that I'm going to make money from the used car and you're going to get the used car and enjoy it. Whereas if I steal something from you, I have no realistic expectation that you're going to get something. There's not a conflict. There's a complete abandonment of your interests. So where does theft fit in? Well, we'll go backwards for a moment, and it fits in with this one, honor and accountability, and also with this one, which is integrity. So if you steal from somebody, then you're demonstrating a lack of integrity, and if you try to hide it, then you're violating this principle of honor and accountability. So theft is distinct. Empowerment. Anytime I'm trying to give a person more choice, more opportunity, more independence, I'm giving them empowerment. Empowerment means that the person has more power over themselves. That's called autonomy. And we could also have talked about power over the world. We call that authority. But the ethical part of this is the autonomy part. So if I am taking away people's choices or forcing my choices on them, there's a good chance I'm violating this concept. Next is collaboration and consultation. In the first module, we talked about these separately, but for the sake of this final, I'm quite happy if you combine them. Collaboration simply means I work alongside of other people in providing service and supports, and those people can be paid, unpaid, or a combination. And almost always it involves the client, him or herself, in that collaborative process. Consultation is closely related. It means that I ask people for their input, including the client. It means I get opinions and information and background information about people. It means I get expertise outside of my area before I make a decision. So in a nutshell, this decision-making skill means that, or this working together means I only am working ethically when I work with others collaboratively instead of being in competition, and when I get information. So here's an example of a violation of the collaborative principle. If I go and I develop a program for a client, but I never got it checked out by my supervisor, never got it signed off, and I'm just going out and randomly doing these new strategies, I'm being outside of this ethic because there's no safeguard there at all to make sure that what I've done is actually meeting all of the tests that this organization might have. Safety refers to the physical principles of safety that would apply.
Mary Pat, we will have a wet spill in the women's washroom upstairs. Mary Pat, wet spill, women's washroom upstairs. Thank you.
Well, I could have edited that out, but I think if you've come this far, you probably found that just about as humorous as I did. So I'm actually leaving that in there. Okay, and Mary Pat's probably going up there to wipe that floor because safety is at issue. So safety refers to the physical safety of people. And of course, you must remember that it's referring not to the idea that we must protect people from every possible thing that could happen to them, but that we must take reasonable measures to minimize harm. This includes things like financial safety, not just physical safety. Whenever we do medication procedures safely, we're upholding this principle. But if we cut corners on that, then we're not. If we, for example, don't do fire drills, we're not doing this. And if we don't use food safe procedures, we're violating all of these. Okay, I also want to just point out to you that in this handout, there are all of these CSW principles from the Community Support Workers Association, and you're more than welcome, although I'm not going to go through them right now, to refer to them. I'm going slow enough that you could pause them if you needed to and look at them this way. And again, you're more than welcome to refer to these in the exercises. All I would ask is that you don't refer to them just by number. You have to actually tell me what they say. Okay, so I'm going to go slowly, but not too slowly. And continuing, just going slow enough so that if you wanted to transcribe these, you could do that if you have lost your handout. And again, you could do that by pausing. And there should only be one more after this. And there we go. Oh, I lied. Mistaken. All right, now this is the part I wanted to finish up with on this module, and then, like I said, I'll loop back to the first module. So, how do I test to make sure what I'm dealing with is actually an ethics issue? The very first thing is something that we might call the smell test. And this is where most students begin, and that is that they just have an instinct that something is wrong. But that instinct should only be enough to make us dig deeper, to actually begin an analytical process. If you're only using this smell test to do your assignment, chances are that's why you're not having the success that you need. You need to go to this level of analysis next. One of the things you need to analyze first is, am I talking about a practice or am I talking about an ethic? And one of the ways you can tell is that practices there might be more than one way to do something ethically, and that's called practice. But there's only one ethic that can apply. Practices are methods that we may or may not prefer, but they are unethical, but they are, still ethical. So an example of this in the case study was that people were asked, what do you do if you're upset that this person's doctor has refused them care? And some of you said, well, it would be unethical for the worker to get angry at the doctor. And you're wrong, unfortunately. That's not unethical. It's probably very bad practice, but it's considered ethical still. So you have to be able to point specifically at a principle to be able to say that something is unethical. And as long as it violates just one principle, then you can say it's unethical. But if it doesn't violate a principle, then it's not unethical. So some of you accurately said, well, there's no principle that says husbands and wives can't work together. There is a principle that says it has to be declared, but not that it can't happen ever. So if you saw that, you saw that there's a policy in an organization that says something isn't okay, and that's their practice. But another organization might achieve another way of handling that, such as saying we hire husbands and wives, but we don't put them on shift at the same time. We also want to make sure we understand the difference between just giving a label to something versus actually knowing how to do something. So when something's a practice issue, we typically deal with it by addressing the person who made the mistake and suggesting a different approach. We might, for example, make a suggestion of a new approach, or we might take some training, or we might refer it to somebody to help us resolve a conflict. But when it's an ethical issue, when a principle is violated, our response is pretty simple, which is to document, protect the individual, and report it as soon as possible. If it's not acted upon, we may even need to report it further up the ladder or again. So how do I do that? Again, analytical process. Number one, first, are you certain that the actual behavior you've heard about has occurred? If you saw it and you are, then you're moving to step two. But if you aren't, you're going to investigate a bit further till you find out. If the specific issue is abuse or neglect, then remember, as soon as we suspect abuse, we report it and we document it. If we can say, after we've confirmed that the behavior has occurred, that a principle was violated, then we can talk about it from an action on a principle, which is to report it, which is right here. So we have to have those principles. We have to literally know them so well that we can specifically say that's a violation of conflict of interest or that's a violation of accountability. And if it's a practice issue, then we can give feedback to the individual, or we as a team can try to find a different approach. So it's very important to know the difference between practices and ethics because they have completely different ways of being managed. If the behavior has some element of risk, danger, or illegal, if it's imminent, then we not only report it, but we also have to do some work to protect that individual who might be affected right away. So for example, in the case of an abuse allegation, we might want to make sure we keep that client safe from that abuser, and if there's first aid or something like that that needs to happen, we would do it. If it's a different practice that we're talking about, then we're going to have a strategic approach, which simply means that I'm going to go and approach my colleague and speak to them in a way that I know is more likely to be effective. So I'm going to use, for example, that hear, care, and return technique, or that ownership statement that we talked about in the communications module. And if it was unethical, but it's not an immediately risky situation, then I'm going to go up the ladder to a superior, and they are going to manage it. Don't always expect that the person is going to be visibly disciplined or fired. The employer may manage it in some other way. Did the situation improve? Well, then yes, you consider it to be resolved. But if it didn't, if you don't see evidence that the situation has been addressed, then you can report it up the ladder or resolve it some other way. So it's important that it is not immediately forgotten just because you reported it. Okay, so remember that all the principles must be applied all the time and that they are equally important. In the scenarios, you're sometimes asked to think about a flawed argument somebody might use. And this is the point it's referring to, that sometimes people think about the principles as being more important than each other. And so it's quite common for people to defend one approach by saying, well, I chose this approach because I thought safety was number one, and so I sacrificed dignity. And when you're taking that flawed argument, you want to be able to listen for that way of thinking, because they have to attend to safety and dignity and accountability and integrity and all of these principles at the same time, which makes it challenging. The degree of misconduct is not a product of how many principles have been violated. If, for example, I stab somebody with a knife, you could argue that I have violated a couple of principles, the safety principle, the integrity principle. If I go and I report it to the police right away, it probably is not going to change the fact that this will be seen as a very serious issue. If, on the other hand, I have a bad habit of leaving my petty cash undone and not locking it, not doing accurate records and not keeping receipts, I'm probably violating a number of different policies. I'm being inefficient, or sorry, principles. I'm being inefficient. I'm not being accountable. I'm not being not being effective. All of these things, and yet probably that would not be seen as being on the intensity scale of the first one. Sometimes people can behave in a way that is ethical but still have a negative effect. And this is important. Just because a person gets hurt doesn't mean somebody didn't behave ethically. And so if I'm going to accuse a person of unethical behavior, I must be able to say, here's where they violated a principle. If I can't do that, then that's not going to be an example of unethical behavior. For example, if I took a client to the swimming pool and he was a normally ambulatory person, there was no normal health risk, and he fell while trying to dive off the diving board, I could not be accused of doing something unethical because there's really nothing about that scenario that should stipulate I should have done something extra. And remember, the other side of the equation is just even if I'm doing my best, if I do something unethical, it doesn't mean that I'm okay just because I had a heart that was in the right place. If, for example, I was a bus driver and I said, well, the children get really cold when I make them stand outside while I check for any kind of mechanical issues on my bus. So rather than check it, I thought I would drive to the school and then I would inspect it after the children got off. Well, that's an example of neglect. And unfortunately, even though that bus driver's got the best of intentions, they violated the principle. And even though it's not spoken about in the slide, it's important to understand they violated that principle even if the client didn't get hurt. Even if the bus didn't have an accident, they still have violated that principle. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all these ones further, but you do have them in your handout. What I am going to do is switch to the initial module. Now, you can choose not to follow along with this if you so desire. This is just for those people who don't remember what was in the first module or who weren't there. So I'm going to quickly go through these principles, very quickly compared to the last one. And again, if you need me, I'm available. This one, I really want to point out that on the left-hand side of these principles is the definition, and on the right-hand side is the test. How can you tell? So this was our first module. Effectiveness and quality basically says that I have to do my job in a way that I know is likely to work. I can fail, but not knowingly go into something expecting to fail. Okay? We talked about safety already, minimizing risk. That doesn't mean I can't do anything that's dangerous. For example, I could go skiing with somebody, but I couldn't take somebody skiing and, for example, go to the top most difficult run without giving them proper training, proper equipment, proper safety devices, and supervision. As I said in the bus example, even if nothing bad happens, if I didn't follow procedures, then I violated this principle. So if, for example, I'm careless when I'm giving medicines, it doesn't matter if I never have a medicine error, I'm still violating this principle. Accountability, I always talk about this as being the equation of responsibility and openness put together, and that's what accountability is. So for example, if somebody wants to know something, I have to be able to show them through my notes or my receipts that I actually acted the way I said. I can never lie or hide, and if somebody wants to investigate me, I have to answer the questions openly and honestly. I can't say I take the fifth. I can't say I refuse to answer because it might incriminate me. That's an American thing, and it doesn't apply here. Currency and expertise, we talked about this. I have to remain up to date, and I have to make sure I don't accept work that I'm not qualified for. If I falsified a resume, this would be another example of violating this one. Efficiency and value, I cannot waste anything knowingly. So that doesn't mean, again, that if I tried cooking something and I burnt it by accident, that I have knowingly created an inefficiency. But let's say I decided I was going to go out tomorrow and buy $1,000 worth of groceries. And my colleagues told me that we had an account at Costco, but I wanted to just go down the street to Safeway because it was faster. That would be an example because I could probably save quite a bit on my groceries by going where the staff told me. Commitment to basic morality. So we talked about this one as honesty and integrity in the other module. It's very similar. You cannot lie, cheat, steal, abuse, neglect, knowingly violate the law, defraud people, and so forth. And this includes outside of your work. So that honor one fits here as well. So if you're getting confused and you're saying, well, Paul, which one should I name it? It's okay to use either one. I don't have a problem with you using either one because these are the language that are used in the field. Either one of them is acceptable. Conflict of interest, I think we've talked about at quite a lot of detail, so it's here if you want to. Information and consent, I spoke about it briefly before, but remember it says information and consent, so both of these must be there. Information means that I give people the information they need before I ask them to make a choice. And I must get their permission or choice before I can do any type of procedure that might affect them. So for example, moving a person's one bedroom from one floor to another would be something that requires consent, or utilizing a client's possessions without asking them. We're going to move on to the tenets that are specific to community support work. All the ones we just did are in every profession, but these ones are also the one we're about to get into, specific to our field. Dignity we've talked about is the emotional, spiritual, and social well-being of clients. It's not enough to simply just keep people physically safe. We must also make sure that we give people their dignity. So that means that's connected to that idea of empowerment, but it's also connected to the idea of not humiliating people, not showing disrespect. And interestingly, I can have a dignity issue even if a person's not present. So if I call somebody a bad word and they're not even there to hear it, then we could definitely argue that's a dignity eroding thing to do. Consultation, this is the main idea here. I must get information and content and communication from other people, including the client himself, their family, and other professionals. I cannot act as an island unto myself. This one has not really been talked about very much in the other module, but it's an important one. And this means that I must grow alongside of the client. I cannot just do whatever I want to do. I have to incorporate adaptability and growth. If, for example, a person breaks a house rule and I just kick them out, then I have violated this principle. Even if I believe the person isn't well suited, I have to find a way to adaptively make the change in service. So for example, I might transition them to a home that I felt was more appropriate by talking to the new home and so forth. So by the way, you may say, well, Paul, can you kick a person out? Doesn't that violate this concept of choice that you're going to come to later on? And the answer is no, it doesn't, because people are normally told the policies before they ever come in the door. If they're not told that policy, then that's definitely an issue. But if, for example, a home says you're not allowed to use alcohol in this home, and a person chooses to use alcohol, then it can be argued they have made a choice. As long as we don't just toss them out on the street without any how do you do, we are okay. But we do have to do some type of planning or adapting. Accountability to indirect consumers is just a specifier on the accountability spoken of earlier. So we not only have to answer questions directly to our clients, but also to many others. And if you think about this, it makes sense. Often our clients have reasons why they cannot express their needs very clearly. They might be compromised intellectually, they might have mental health issues. So we not only need to be able to respond to their families, but also to those people who are professionally employed to act as their accountability mechanisms. And this includes their social worker, the licensing department, the public trustee, and sometimes other medical professionals. And remember as well that if you're talking about somebody who's under 19, that client is considered legally to be their family. If you're out in the community, even the community is an indirect consumer. And while you cannot talk about an individual's personal details, you can answer questions in a general way about your programming, because the public is paying for it and has a right to expect a high degree of professionalism. Choice facilitation. Basically, this goes back to that idea of being client-centered, but we must actively facilitate choice making. We must teach people how to make choices, let them know that they are allowed to make choices, and actually give them the opportunity to make choices. If we do not allow that, if we prohibit people from making a reasonable choice, then we're violating this. Now, reasonable is always difficult, but if, for example, a person says, I want to smoke, that's not an unreasonable choice because lots of people smoke. You don't have to share their values. If they want to get married and they're in a same-sex relationship and you use your values to tell them they can't, you're violating this principle. On the other hand, if the person says to you, I want to go and run into the middle of the freeway, then for sure that's not what we would consider to be a reasonable choice. It looks to me like it's a pretty inevitable choice to kill themselves. We talked about this here before. These are the three things in a nutshell that I just said. Telling people that they have authority, giving them the actual skills to do that, and giving them opportunities to do that. If you need to look at that slide in more detail, you can pause. Advocacy and protection. So we have to act on people's behalf when they're not treated fairly and speak up for them. If we don't do that, then they're going to continuously be violated or intruded upon. And an even better approach is to help the client to learn how to do this for themselves. Okay? Protecting people is part of this. So, for example, reporting suspected abuse would be an upholding of this principle, and not reporting abuse would be a violation of this principle. So this is a really important concept. In many of the cases that we're looking at, there are ethics applying to you as well as to the person that you're looking at. Because if you don't act, then you're violating this ethic right here. Your ethic is to advocate. Human rights, those are, again, I'm not going to go through them, but one of the things you're advocating for are these rights, and people have the same rights as you. In the other module, we refer to this as equity. So if you're wondering how that fits, equity is the ability to have all of these same rights. Personal fitness is not described in the other module, but it is an important one. And this means that I should not be working if I am not personally fit to be there. So, for example, if I have a sickness that might pass on to a client, or if I came to work and I was hungover, or if I came to work and I was emotionally distracted, I should not do my job that day. And I should not put myself knowingly into a position where I might get hurt. So even if I see two clients fighting each other, it's actually unethical for me to walk into the middle of that interaction when it's very likely that would result in me getting injured. Abdicating for professionalism I spoke of before, so I won't go through it again. It's the basic idea that even when a client is not directly harmed, we have an ethical responsibility to speak up and not allow erosion to occur. Privacy and confidentiality, again, three parts here. Privacy of information, and that refers to written information, verbal information, and electronic, and it refers to information about your clients, your coworkers, and your employer. It also refers to body privacy, which includes things like touch, medical procedures, invasion of personal space, eye contact, and so forth. And then the third one is treating people's ownership with respect, so respecting their possessions and their private spaces. So there it is again, in more detail. If you need to pause that, you can. And promotion of independence. We talked about empowerment in the most recent module, but this is very much connected to that. The idea that we must actually help people to do as much for themselves as possible. And I'm going to kind of jump to the next slide because it gets into more definition of this. The first of these two principles is the principle of least intrusion. And the name sort of says it all, that it's our principle that we should invade people's lives to the lowest possible degree. So that means not getting into their personal space, not getting into their relationships any more than we need to. Let's say a client is in conflict with his mother. Your job is not to mediate that conflict. So unless one of them asks you to get involved, normally you would be intruding too much if you got involved in that, and the better procedure would be to get out of it. Least restriction is the opposite. And now we're talking about not unnecessarily putting controls or limits on people. So we want to gradually see people doing more and more and more for themselves and needing less and less oversight or limiting from us. So if a person wants to go to the movies, do we have to always go into the movies with them? Or could we go to the movies in a way that maintains a safe monitoring distance and gives that person the opportunity to have as much independence as possible? And again, remember what we said. People are allowed to make mistakes and to fail. This goes back to our concept of dignity of risk. Letting people go out and experience failure or risk is a healthy thing to do. And instead of stopping people from doing that, instead we want to try and be there providing some kind of support after they have experienced that. And again, those fundamental principles are in this module as well. Although the language is slightly different, they all have that same type of content. The acid test is referring to this as well. So all of that stuff is there. Now, hopefully that gives you some picture as to what you want to do as you move forward in this module. But if you are struggling, if you find that you don't understand the questions, if you still don't understand the difference between a practice and an ethic, if you cannot explain why what you should do is connected to principles, check with me before you submit that final assignment. That's the critical thing to take away from this. I hope that's been helpful.